town of Oswego?
Well, it was obviously a simpler way of life. When we use that term, the good old days, we really, when we say that, we don't mean we want to return to a time with no plumbing and have outhouses and things like that. We just mean times were simpler. It wasn't so how do I say it? It just wasn't so complicated, and we just had the simple things in life, the basic characteristics and needs. And that's what the businesses were. We had small grocery stores, and in the city of Oswego, there was like a small food store, and every other corner or so, and they all made a living doing that. In the town of Oswego, we had quite a few blacksmith shops. We had many clay yards, small brick yards. We had the honeybee business, a lot of cheese, quite a few cheese factories. When I say a lot, quite a few cheese factories, maybe 8 or 9 in the town. Cider and vinegar mills, and of course farms. Not any large farms, but the small dairy farms, and because every family was basically self-contained but self-sufficient as far as their food supply.
What was schooling like?
Schooling, we had the traditional country schools. We probably had around 14 districts within the town of Oswego. And Dr. Mary Walker's father, Alva Walker Sr., started the first what they call the free school, right up on Bunker Hill. And most of them were one-room schoolhouses, all 8 grades. We had at least a couple schools that there were 2-room schoolhouse, and where they divided the smaller grades from the larger grades of 7th and 8th grades or so forth. Mm-hmm. And they were taught by usually one teacher. Growing up on Bunker Hill, she was heavily influenced by particularly her father, her mother as well, but particularly her father, Alva Walker, who was a man way ahead of his time as far as looking into health things, and even dress reform. She was influenced by him as far as the dress reform, that the clothes that women wore at that time, he said, were not healthy for them. They were too binding. But she went to the Bunker Hill School. She was very attentive to academic things and what was going on around her as far as the abolition movement. She remembers she was probably maybe 9 or 10 when the famous abolitionist Garrett Smith came to Bunker Hill and lectured. So she was just, I wouldn't say, I don't really know whether she was a quote-unquote normal girl growing up as far as playing and things like that, but she was certainly attuned to more academic things than maybe most children were. Again, that was under the influence of her father, saying that we needed women in the medical field, and he had his own home remedies and things like that. But he says this is a field that women should go into to just be to be a catalyst for more women to enter into the field of medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Well, because a lot of people didn't want to go to a female doctor. Even some females I understand. Because it had been traditionally a male role. And in fact, when she did finally meet President Lincoln and had an appointment with him to try to get be appointed a surgeon in the Civil War, he said that he really couldn't do that because that would upset the males in the medical field. That's just been mentioned in the new book called Six Encounters with President Lincoln. Yeah, she was a great one for sanitary methods and making sure things were clean, instruments and so forth. And she was really against all the many amputations of limbs that were performed at that time, and saying that some of them were not necessary. And because some died because of the unsanitary conditions, some died with the when they took the limbs off and poison and infection did set in. But she was really concerned, compassionate, and I understand that she, attending soldiers that were dying, wrote letters, the last letters, to their family and homes, and made sure the family knew of the condition and final passing of their son or husband or loved one. Yes, they did. Many of them did respect her, and for her, again, her compassionate side to, in being with them. She joined the Army in an Ohio regiment, or Kentucky actually, and she was associated with one of the regiments in Ohio. She was at the Battle of Chickamauga, where she came in contact with General Thomas, and it was General Thomas as well as General Sherman who later recommended her for the receiving of the Medal of Honor under President Andrew Johnson. She was at the Battle of Fredericksburg as well. Yeah, she was captured, and then she was in prison, but she was released for an officer of equal rank, which was unusual at that time with a female. Yeah, she was through the recommendation of Generals Thomas and Sherman. She received the Medal of Honor. And of course, the Medal of Honor was instituted during the Civil War. But to date, 2017, she's the only female that has ever received the Congressional Medal of Honor. After the Civil War, she lectured particularly on dress reform, and then as well as suffrage, the women's rights to vote. Lectured throughout the United States as well as England and France. It depends on her audience, and many of the women, as I said, or most women, were really appreciative of her seemingly understanding of dressing at that time, and that there were women who were willing to get out of their tight corsets and have something more comfortable. And it was really, but she explained why, that it was more healthy for them and for their bodies and so forth. She wore the trousers and then a skirt over it. But you see, it was interesting that she even put the skirt over it because, being in the battlefield and so forth, that must have been a hindrance at sometimes. But she designed her own costume in the war. And of course, then she, in her later years, she was attired in male clothing because, again, it was, she felt it was just freer and she felt more free in it as far as movement and so forth.
And at that time, was that very acceptable?
No, it was not. No, it was not acceptable at all by women or men because it was so different. And so the people I knew growing up as a kid, that they were older then, but they did remember her when they were younger, and there were some that dwelled on her idiosyncrasies, and they were idiosyncrasies for that time, not necessarily, they wouldn't be considered idiosyncrasies now, or something strange, but they did at the time. But there were some of the older ones, when I was a kid, that remembered her, that realized that she had done some great things. And I remember my maternal grandmother saying when I was 8 or 9 years old, I want to take you to the museum in Oswego so you can see Dr. Mary Walker's things. And so she's the first one that told me about Dr. Mary Walker. And my grandmother was a school teacher, and she was ahead of her time in many ways too. So, and then Dr. Walker, made the statement that people wouldn't really realize what she had done until long after her death, and that's true over about 150 years later. And that quote of hers is on the statue of her in front of the Oswego Town Hall. For the women's suffrage movement, she was very broad in her thinking of that. In other words, she wanted suffrage for all females, and including the African Americans, and even she realized the contributions of the Native American women. But her main the main ones in the suffrage movement, Anthony. Who was that other one? Susan B. Anthony. There was Carrie Chapman. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They thought, again, with the male attire, she was too strange and odd in the dress reform, but the main conflict with Dr. Walker and the other suffrage leaders was over the fact of the constitutional amendment for women's rights. She did not believe that there needed to be amendment in the Constitution, that the Constitution already gave females the rights that males had. So that was the main division there. So I would say they separated themselves from her, because they didn't think, she was such a fervent believer in not having a constitutional amendment.
That was already in there? That it was already in there?
Yeah, it was already inherent in the Constitution.
Exactly.
Which, I say this too, but I think our First Lady Betty Ford said the same thing, that there didn't need to be any constitutional amendment for women to vote. It was inherent in the document. Traveling abroad, traveling abroad. She lectured, I said, in England and in Paris. And she was in Paris like in 1867 about dress reform and so forth. And then she traveled abroad. She traveled quite a bit here in the old country. I think one thing also that she was not a woman of means or money, and which I think probably the suffrage leaders like Anthony and Stanton and so forth, they had money behind them, which I'm sure helped in the cause. But Mary Walker did not have wealth behind her, and so there was times of struggling. But she went throughout the United States, again, lecturing on the suffrage as well as just women's rights, in general. It was divided. As I say, I would say probably the minority treated her well, because she was so way ahead of her time and so, so different. School children, especially the boys, would sort of mock her. We read, and of course they got there from their appearance. I'm sure that, how strange this woman was. But you look back, I remember when I first read her book, Hit, which is now in paperback and people can buy that. And my first thought of it was, what was so controversial about this? And again, in today's world, we especially young people forget what their grandparents thought and went through, and her book Hit is perfectly understood today about women's rights and and the relationships and so forth. Yeah, she would. Number one, I think, would be she was a visionary. She looked way ahead, and there are very, very few people that are visionaries. How always have been in history. Very few alive today, but she was a visionary. I call her, Dr. Snyder, the college professor who wrote the first biography of Dr. Mary, called her the little lady in pants. And I like to call her the little lady from Bunker Hill. That's Bunker Hill, New York. And that's kind of interesting, too. The origin of the road Bunker Hill and the hill itself was named from her father, Alva Walker. Before they came to central New York, they were near Boston, Massachusetts, near Bunker Hill. And he said he named the place Bunker Hill because he hoped that it would be a place of many battles for civil rights and for education. And so I like to call her the little lady from Bunker Hill, who sat in every president's office from Abraham Lincoln through Woodrow Wilson. So she was a visionary. Her, again, dress reform, that was very, very important for the health, the physical health, and emotional health of a woman. And then the idea that, the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, declared for every human that they had the rights. It didn't matter whether you were female or whether you were male. So those are, I think the three things that I would rank.
Do you think she'd be that revolutionary?
I don't think so, because she wouldn't have to be that revolutionary. Because many of the reforms she fought for are just taken. Unfortunately, they're taken for granted today. I remember when Secretary of State Clinton was running for Senate, someone said, I don't know if they actually told her that, but he says, you wouldn't be wearing slacks and pants if it wasn't for Dr. Mary Walker, and it's just an accepted thing now. That she was a very anti-imperialist. In other words, she was against the war with the Philippines in the 1890s. She was against the annexation of Hawaii and spoke up for the native rights there. She befriended Queen Liliuokalani, the last queen of Hawaii. And she was not that unhappy when McKinley was shot. And in fact, she made some statements publicly when he was shot. And she was investigated by what would be the FBI today about those statements. She made the statements in the railroad station here in Oswego, New York. So that's all been documented as well in the newspapers and so forth.